So, without further ado, just like to introduce Guy from Friends of the Earth, who's going to talk about national targets that they have for tree planting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Camilla. So yeah, let me just share my screen with you because I've got some slides I want to show to everyone. So yes, as Camilla said, my name's Guy. I work for Friends of the Earth. I'm working on our trees campaign, which launched last year. And I just wanted to start off with a quite startling statistic. Many of you may be familiar with this one, but I think it's worth restating all the same, which is that just 13% of the UK's total land area is woodland. And that's even worse in England, where it's only 10% of our land area in England, compared to an EU average of 38%. And that's not even the highest in the world. There's many other countries that have higher levels of woodland cover. So from our perspective, from Friends of the Earth's view, that's just not good enough, particularly in a time of climate and ecological emergency. We've got very, very low levels of woodland cover in England and across the UK, and we need to do better. And that's why last summer we launched our campaign to double UK tree cover. This is the petition we launched with. It's got more than 170,000 signatures now. If you haven't yet signed it, you can do so on our website at friendsoftheearth.uk/trees. I'll be flagging up that URL link later on as well. Just essentially, we're doing this because of two reasons, really: the climate emergency and the ecological emergency. And trees are, we think, one of the brilliant natural climate solutions out there that are vital to both help combat climate change and climate breakdown, and also they provide a huge vibrant habitat for lots of species. So they're helping to address the dual ecological emergency we also face. And so just to give a bit more detail on the climate aspect of this, we think that the UK should be aiming to double forest area to curb climate change, because we've done some calculations. We reckon that if we did so, if we doubled the area of woodland we have in the UK, that it would end up absorbing somewhere in the region of 47 to 50 million tonnes of CO2 every year. Once you got to that level, and that's not a small amount to be sniffed at. That's about 10% of current UK greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we obviously think that you need to be doing a huge amount to be cutting existing greenhouse gas emissions. We need to be radically reducing carbon emissions across the economy. It is the case, though, that there will be some sectors in which it will be very hard to completely decarbonise, such as agriculture, for example. So it will be hard to get rid of some of those sort of some of them are biogenic or natural emissions that just come about through sort of cultivating soils and so on. So it's quite hard to completely eliminate those. And also, there's already too much carbon in the atmosphere. We need to be working out how to drag some of that down and storing it in the safest possible way. And we think that trees, alongside other natural climate solutions like restoring peatlands and species-rich grasslands, are really important parts of the way in which we help to tackle climate change, alongside those radical reductions in pollution and emissions as well. So when it comes to looking at some of the barriers to doubling tree cover or increasing tree cover to any level, should you so wish, there are really three main barriers. The first is money, the second is land, and the third, this one I added in more recently, and I'll tell you why in a bit, is lack of political ambition. And just to say a bit more about each of them. In the money front, it's not really so much the fact that tree saplings are expensive, they're very cheap. Indeed, if you're happy to see trees reseed and naturally regenerate, you could argue that that's essentially a free service that nature's providing. Really, the money is needed to pay landowners and land managers to not do something else with the land. So to allow trees to grow on that land rather than it being used for farming or housing or development or shooting, or whatever it is that it's currently used for. And the stat that I've just flagged up in this slide, I think is another quite startling one. It's that the UK government spends less than £1 per person on trees every year. So it's really, really low. We think that actually if you were to double UK forest cover, you'd need probably something like £10 per head. every year. It still doesn't sound like very much, really, does it? And in the end, in the grand scheme of things, that's still a rounding error in the Treasury's annual budget. So it's a very cheap part of the solution to climate change. Just to quickly talk about land. Land, I think, is a much more fundamental issue with trying to increase the number of trees. Obviously have to engage with landowners, whether that's public sector landowners like councils or private sector landowners like the aristocracy or charities or whoever. But there's also a question, obviously, of land use. We obviously need land for lots of other reasons. We need land for housing, we need land to grow food, particularly agriculture, which takes up 70% or so of the UK's land surface. You know, you could start getting into issues of competition between land for food and land for nature if we were not careful. And obviously we wouldn't want to be advocating something where we simply double UK tree cover, turn the UK into a lovely parkland, but end up completely exporting the problem of food production to other countries, where you could, of course, inadvertently add to deforestation or other pressures on habitats in other countries. So, you know, Brazilian deforestation of the Amazon, for example, being driven partly by the West's desire for you know, meat consumption and so on. So one of the things that we've been looking at is we've been doing some quite detailed modelling using maps, spatial data, GIS data, to try and look at how you could double tree cover in the UK and particularly in England. And we think that you can do so actually relatively easily. But one of the things that we do have to do in order to free up more land is to start to shift our diets. And that involves eating less but better meat and dairy, becoming vegetarian or vegan if you wish, but also reducing the overall population's consumption of meat and dairy and buying better quality stuff when you do eat meat. And that actually, because grazing of land is so ultimately wasteful, it actually will free up a huge amount more land for other purposes if we were to do that. And that's one of the ways in which we think you can double tree cover. So we've done some modelling. We've actually found that if you can double tree cover in England without impacting on any other priority habitats, whether that's peat or grassland, anything like triple SI, special science, sites of special scientific interest, or anything like that. And you can also do so without impacting on valuable valuable farmland. Sorry, there's a kind of term for that, which is agricultural land grades 1 to 3. So essentially, what we're saying is, yes, we think we can do this. We've got the land. We've got public interest. We don't yet have political interest, and this is where it brings me on to the next barrier. I'll just flick over this slide showing a bit of mapping we've been doing. I've already talked about that. So the lack of political ambition, and I've got a picture here showing you a single tree, slightly windswept. This is on a coastline in Cornwall, and to give you a slightly ironic picture alongside the England tree strategy, which my understanding is that the England tree strategy is about doing more than about just one tree. But I have to say it is somewhat lacking in ambition from our perspective. It's actually a strategy without any target in it, at least for England. So the Conservative government went through the election promising to plant 30,000 hectares of trees per year across the UK, note across the UK. And then it comes out with an England tree strategy, a draft England tree strategy document just a few weeks ago, on which it's now currently consulting, in which it doesn't actually talk about the role that England will play towards that UK-wide target. So what we're very concerned about is that there's been lots of fine words about trees. You know, everybody likes trees. Politicians like planting trees and associating themselves with planting trees. But when it comes to the crunch, when it comes to the actual policy and the strategy that's been laid out, politicians seem to be kind of wriggling out of actually committing serious amounts of money or targets or action towards delivering more trees. So we'd like to see the England tree strategy seriously toughened up. It needs to have a target. We think, as we've done the mapping and the modelling for this, that it's quite possible to double tree cover in England. Why wouldn't we? Let's do something like that. And so if you want to get involved with some of this stuff, some of this campaigning, and share your views, and if you share our frustrations about this, there's lots of ways you can get involved. Firstly, you can sign up a petition. Secondly, you can submit views to the England tree strategy. We've got various ways in which you can do that and make it easier to do so. And thirdly, I would talk about all of these more in a minute, which is about calling on your councillors to double tree cover in their areas, because I think it's really important that we have lots of local plans to also increase tree cover as well. Just a bit more detail on each of those ways that you can get involved. We've got a petition. That's simply just going to the government ministers at the URL link in that slide, Friends of the Earth/trees. If you'd like to get a bit more involved and get your teeth more into the ins and outs of the policies being proposed in the England tree strategy, we've got an easy to use tool which allows you to submit your views and evidence to the consultation. That can also be accessed by that same URL. Just scroll down the page a little bit further. And then thirdly, when it comes to contacting your councillors, so there's actually 9 councils in England so far that have already signed up to double tree cover, which is fantastic. Lots more councils that are doing lots of really interesting things with trees as well, and increasing the amount of woodland cover. We'd love to see more councils signing up to doing the same. If you want to get in touch with your councillor, then you can use our tool there as well. On that, I think I'll leave you this beautiful picture of some beech woods in the Surrey Hills. Incidentally, a part of the UK that has about 40% woodland cover. So if Surrey can do that, I think it would be great if other parts of the UK could start to get towards that level as well. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Guy. So we're recording this talk, just FYI. And so all of the links that have been mentioned by Guy and Luke over the course of the event will be embedded there. And I'll put some of them in the chat as well. So if people are raring to go at the end, you'll be able to do that straight away. But anyway, no, thank you very much for that, Guy. And over to Luke.
Thanks, Camilla, and hi everyone. Yeah, and thank you, Guy, for fascinating overview. Really great overview. And I would just say that most of what Guy has said, the National Trust agrees with. Essentially, we're there and we're on board with it. Although our sort of target and strategy is subtly different to Friends of the Earth. The big picture stuff is the same. So I suppose what my talk is going to be about, and it's a whistle-stop tour, obviously, is really about what does it mean for one big landowner, what Guy has just said, albeit a landowner that's here for the public good. So I'm really going to talk about, the National Trust's target for woodland creation and tree cover, where the opportunities lie and where some of the challenges lie as well, which will touch on some of the points Guy's made and hopefully sort of flesh them out with some, real life examples, I suppose. So National Trust, we are, bear with me as I navigate the screen. There we go. There's a very typical sort of iconic National Trust view. We're one of the biggest landowners in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We don't have any land in Scotland. We own about 250,000 hectares of land, which is about 1.5% of the land area. Our charitable purpose is really to look after everything we've got, be it land or buildings or anything else, for the benefit of everyone in perpetuity. And we normally sum that up with our sort of catchphrase, which you've probably heard, which is for everyone, forever. That's why we're here, and that's why we look after the places we've got. About 5 years ago, we revolutionised our approach to land in the National Trust. Before that, we were quite a conservative landowner, I think, quite a traditional landowner in some respects. But 5 years ago, we really put nature conservation and sustainable land management at the centre of our strategy, which was absolutely brilliant for those within the organisation who really care about that stuff. Obviously, it's been amazing. And we refreshed that strategy in January. So nature conservation is still front and centre in our strategy. And again, typically internally, and along with a lot of other conservation organisations, I should say, we often refer to our land being about carbon, nature and people. That's what it's all about now for us. Everything I'm saying does come with a little bit of a warning. Like most organisations, we've been massively affected by coronavirus, and we are in the middle of a reset due to that. But I found out this week, I'm very pleased to say that our tree strategy isn't going to be affected by that. So everything I'm going to say in this talk is has been confirmed that it'll continue on the same timelines for the future, which is great, which isn't true for all of our work, unfortunately. So currently, National Trust tree cover reflects the wider picture that Guy mentioned, that just over 10% of our land area in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And using that picture as an illustration, that just shows one of the first grey areas we've got, really. So when the National Trust talk about woodland, we really are talking about the places where we've got a fence around it, we don't let livestock in, and we manage it essentially as like a woodland nature reserve. And bang in the middle of that picture, you can see a wood which we manage as a wood, and it's wall-to-wall trees. But elsewhere in that picture, there's lots of other trees, some at quite high densities, but there's grazing across most of that land, and we wouldn't class that as woodland. But obviously those trees are still doing a brilliant job for carbon, nature and people. So it just sort of illustrates that some of these compartments aren't always very useful, and it can make the picture a little bit more complicated. Anyway, without further ado, onto our target. So we defined this in the refreshed strategy in January, and it forms part of our new aim that we announced in January to be a net zero carbon organisation by 2030, which is pretty ambitious, really. And as Guy said, we really have to cut our emissions. That is the key to carbon net zero. But alongside that, we can provide amazing benefit with these natural solutions. And woodland covers one of the key ones there, alongside a couple of other interventions. And we've committed to increasing our woodland cover from that 10% that I told you about to 17% by 2030, which means about 18,000 hectares of new closed canopy woodland on National Trust land, which is massive. Now, I would say, in line with what I was just saying about how complicated the definition of woodland can be, we are having to just sort of define that a bit more closely. And at the moment, we're really hanging on to the carbon benefit. We think that we can, that level of canopy cover would deliver about 300,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide sequestered over the next 10 years, although that's a really rough estimate. The carbon science is very, very difficult and still developing. Or it's about 20 million trees. And we're really having to hang on to those good bits, because what we think we're going to need to do is deliver a lot more by area, with some places at a lower tree density. That's what's most appropriate for our places. So much less easy to announce with fanfare, but that's the reality of, you know, land use is complex, really. So the first question is often, where's it going to go in terms of the challenges? And I suppose the first thing to say is, where isn't it going to go? So these are the places it's not going to go. Top left, it's not going to go on our species-rich open habitats. And actually, we've got a disproportionately high amount of those in the National Trust, as you might expect, because lots of the places we look after because they're special. Similarly, it's not going to go top right in our historic views or important views or our design landscapes. Bottom left, it's not going to go on our peat bogs, because they're one of our most important stores of carbon currently, and putting trees on them can actually release carbon rather than lock up more. So that's really important. So places like Kinder Scout are, you know, out of the picture. Last but not least, just as four sort of big examples, really, there are other places we're not going to plant trees where we're going to affect our really important archaeology. And hopefully those things go without saying, but I think it's really important to say them, because often when we talk about woodland creation, these are the first things that people pull out of the bag to be naysayers sometimes. So there we go. So where are we going to plant it? We're going to plant it in places like this, what I might politely call boring farmland, that doesn't offer much benefit to the nation. This is a bit of land in South Manchester that had no public access. It's ryegrass field. It's not delivering for nature, it's not delivering for people, it's not delivering for carbon. So what this is going to be is, behind that fence, that is going to be closed canopy woodland, and left of the fence, this is going to be a wood pasture. So there's still going to be a farming element to it, but it'll also really benefit nature and carbon and people, and there'll be new paths as well, I should have said. So that's the kind of place we are looking at. But there's no getting away from the fact that we are talking here about land use change, and as Guy has covered, that gets really, really difficult. Even apart from the food security bit, there are issues of rural livelihoods, you know, farm businesses, the history of farming in the countryside. It gets very, very emotive. And it's really important to say that, you know, it's a big challenge for us, land use change, in delivering this target. But it's not about being anti-farmer, you know. This can be a part of future holistic land management, along with everything else we need from the land, with farmers delivering it all. And that's what we really hope we can achieve over the next 10 years. What's been really useful to us there is the work of people like Guy, you know, which we made reference to with this target, but also the government's independent panel on climate change, the Committee on Climate Change. They have done this brilliant work creating a holistic model of future land use, which shows how we can achieve more land for trees while also not decreasing food security and decarbonising other industries. And as Guy said, you know, it's all about reductions in meat and dairy, reduced carbon intensification of farming, and some other things. So this is some of their work. If you are interested to read it, you know, you can go back to this and look it up. Some brilliant stuff that's been incredibly useful for us. And just to lift a couple of bits, I won't linger on this, but this just shows how the tree planting increase is inherently linked in to other changes that are necessary in the countryside for us to be net carbon zero. Last thing to say, I suppose, there is the Committee on Climate Change ambition is for 2050, or recommendation, I should say, is for 2050, and obviously we're going for 2030. So that was in line with our executive board deciding that, you know, climate change is so urgent, we really need to nail our flag to the mast, which is fantastic again, to be working for an organisation that feels like that. And it's an opportunity for farmers. You know, there are big challenges for the farming industry ahead. Again, I won't go into too much detail with this graph, but this just illustrates how much of farm income currently comes from agriculture, which is the red bit, and how much comes from diversification and subsidy payments. Well, most of those subsidy payments are coming to an end with Brexit. So there's a crisis ahead in farming. And what we need to be ready to do in the National Trust is to work with our farmers to develop new business models so that they can stay on the land, but provide, you know, the food we need, but also all the other public goods that we need, whether that's trees and woodlands or, you know, all manner of other things. But there is going to be a shift in agriculture, and we need to help our tenants adapt to it to provide what we need and to maintain their livelihoods. So what might that new income for farmers look like? You know, there are grant schemes around planting new trees and woodlands. So the new environmental land management scheme is likely to incentivise woodland creation on farms really well. So that will be an income stream for farmers. We know that trees on farms can increase agricultural productivity. So sometimes that's open grown trees and sort of nature conservation style farming, but sometimes that's quite industrial agroforestry operations, where we get more out of the land than we would if there weren't trees there, whether it's better for livestock, like in the bottom right, or better for cereal cropping in the top right. And we need to experiment a lot more with those things. So we've got a couple of trial projects at their early stages in the trust, and we're hoping to develop them more. But there is a challenge with, you know, farmers. It isn't just about finance. There's also a perception thing, you know, and forestry and farming have become really compartmentalized in the countryside, but only over the last sort of 70 years or so since the Second World War. Before that, there was a lot more holistic management of the land, and we really need to bring those disciplines back together and help, you know, farmers and other land managers think about their land in more holistic terms. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. As well as income from grants, there obviously might be, and I've mentioned income from actual production, so that'd be timber in a woodland context, obviously. There's also the sort of diversification bit, you know, so there's no reason that farmers with diversified enterprises, whether they're recreational or tourism enterprises, shouldn't be adding value to those enterprises through woodland. And, you know, some of you in Sheffield will recognise that bottom left, really successful Eccleshall Wood Cafe. You know, and all those other visitor offers that go really well in woods, they can be great for farmers. And obviously, you know, it probably goes without saying they can also be great for people like the National Trust. So, you know, it's not just about farmers, it's also about our visitor offer too. And there'll be a whole range of different interventions at different places. And obviously, you know, the people bit of woodlands isn't just about recreation either. It's also about physical and mental well-being. You know, that simple access to the woods is so important for people. And we did a bit of research that showed 1 in 5 people don't regularly go to a wood. And we want to change that. We want to put our new woods in places where people who don't typically have access to the countryside can access nature. And we did a little bit of really interesting research off the back of that, using some GIS modelling tools that showed if we were to focus our new woodland creation on National Trust farmland, really near where people live, so near the big towns, we could create new access opportunities that would mean that 250,000 people every year who don't currently have local access to the countryside would be able to access the countryside and get into woodland. So that was a really exciting opportunity that we identified there. And then last but not least, thinking about people, let's not forget, it's not just about people going to woods. Woods serve people in lots of other ways. We typically refer to these as ecosystem services. So whether it's flood mitigation, the provision of clean water, provision of clean air, shading, these are also all really important benefits that woodlands give to us, and we need to have an eye on all of those as well. And I'll come on to a couple of examples of those in a moment. So what will it look like on National Trust land? So this is another challenge, really. So those of you who are sort of interested in conservation or woody matters and follow social media, you'll see that the debate around this stuff can be quite polarized. On the one hand, you've got people who want to grow really carbon intensive forestry crops to sequester carbon rapidly. On the other hand, we've got people who are real purists about nature conservation and think we should only be creating new broadleaf woods for nature. And really, I think our take on this is that that polarization isn't helpful. We need to avoid the dogma. We need to embrace the whole spectrum, focus on the site detail and the objectives for any one new woodland, and think about how best can we achieve our mantra of carbon, nature, and people in any one place. So this is a really good example. This is down at Slindon in Sussex, and this is one of our new woodland creation schemes. This one is probably most focused on wildlife and people. So they were interested in linking up those existing mature woods that you can see to increase their benefit for wildlife, and also increasing access to this bit of land for the local population. And this was a really poorly managed old arable farm that is, you know, the net gain in amenity and biodiversity is just off the scale with this project. It's absolutely fantastic. And what you can see there is even within the project, it's really varied. So we've got planted trees off to the right or sort of in the background in front of the mature woodland, natural regeneration off to the left where they've just stuck a deer fence around it and left it to it, and then wood pasture in the middle, creating that sort of mosaic of different habitat types, and also a really nice place to be. What's quite interesting about this place is that it is a nice place to be, but it does demonstrate that woodland creation, actually, when you first do it, can actually be a bit of a boring place to visit. It's not always the most inspirational place, and they've done brilliant things at Slindon to engage the local population in tree planting so that they were really have ownership of the project and want to come and see how it's developing. And they also built this lovely greenwood shelter, and that serves as a focal point for the project. And it means that even if the place isn't incredibly inspiring as a visitor yet, you've got a reason to go and you've got a place to sit. And I think we're going to be looking at that in a lot of our woods where people is part of the objective, is how do we make it a place that people want to come back to. And lots of you will recognise this place. This is one of the cloughs. I think this is just above Slippery Stones in the Upper Derwent, there in the National Trust Ranges, planting trees. And this is a very different type of project. This is much more about water. So lots of this reforestation of the clough woodlands in the Peak District has been funded by the water company, because woodlands on these slopes clean the water before it hits the reservoir, which saves them money post-reservoir. So it makes financial sense for them to do it. We also want to reforest the cloughs because there'll be a huge benefit for wildlife there. There's very few clough woodlands left, and where they are, they're very, very species-rich places. So we want to benefit that. And this also illustrates that sort of spectrum of approaches. So this picture doesn't illustrate it very well, but typically in the cloughs, we're planting at a slightly lower density, actually. So in carbon terms per hectare, we're not achieving as much, but it's the right thing to do in terms of landscape and wildlife in those places. I should just make a note on plastic tubes, which we're trying our damnedest to move away from, but there are still the odd place where we have to use them. But I think we've probably overused them in the past, along with everybody else. Last but not least, in terms of my examples, some of you again will recognise this. This is Hardwick Hall. This is as you drive up the main drive and look left. You used to approach Hardwick Hall, you know, one of the jewels in the crown of the National Trust estate in building terms, through a pretty, I hesitate to say grim, a very typical industrial arable farm. But what's really exciting here is that working in partnership with the current farm tenant, which is really crucial, we're restoring a lot of that arable to a wood pasture, which is brilliant. So this is one of the last photos you'll hopefully ever see of this old bit of historic parkland, you know, under stubble. And if you go back in a few years, this will hopefully be rough grazing with a really lovely structure in the sward, full of invertebrates and other life, with a lot more trees, but becoming those lovely open grown trees. So quite low density, but again, it's the right intervention for that landscape. We couldn't do closed canopy woodland here. It wouldn't be appropriate in that historic landscape. But what we will achieve is something that's really brilliant for carbon, nature and people, again, by doing a different approach. So really, yeah, thank you for listening. And my key messages are that, you know, as Guy has said, a massive increase in woodland and tree cover is completely vital in order to deliver net carbon as a nation and for the National Trust. We're completely committed to it, and we've got this ambitious target by 2030. We haven't signed up formally to the Friends of the Earth target, but those of you any good at maths will realise that, you know, we'd only need to do another 3% between 2030 and 2050 to get there. That's my view, by the way, not the National Trust's. But and last but not least, on National Trust land, it will take lots of form. Site detail will be key, and woodland and wooded habitats will have carbon, nature, and people as their primary objectives. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. If you just perfect.
There we go.
Thank you. So this has been a bit of a dream team, because I always find it's, I think since I guess you could say, I'm quite interested in the revelation that comes with realizing that trees do offer extraordinary sort of manifold solutions to many challenges that, you know, we are presented with. There are some themes that I think have come through in some of the questions, but I think we can take from this point onwards a kind of questions to the panel. I think one of the things that strikes me, and I've really appreciated in both of your talks, is the necessity for big, as you know, to have these ambitious targets, but also an acceptance of the complexity and reality. And that is, you know, for me, I think that's the most important thing we can embed in any conversations about trees is, you know, it's not, although at times it might seem straightforward, there is a general understanding of lots of other issues to do with land ownership and land stewardship, and, you know, how people's perception of certain landscapes is challenged by change, by the planting of trees. So, you know, making sure that that is front and centre. You touched upon Brexit and kind of Corona, so it'd be interesting to see if anyone's got any questions. We'll start going through those now, but do feel free to add in any more, and we've got 25 minutes or so. So yeah, thank you. The first question actually that came in whilst, I think this is just for Guy, but this is from Joe, who asks, can you tell us more about opportunities to increase urban tree cover versus encouraging farmers to plant more trees and change farming practices? And is one easier than the other? So I guess one thing is we've had quite maybe a slightly more rural focus. So how do we translate some of this into urban tree planting targets?
Yeah, sure. And I think Joe Birch and I were having a bit of a Twitter conversation beforehand about how our names are perfectly suited to discussions about trees. So I'm very happy to be a trees campaigner with the surname Shrubsole. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, yeah, I have focused a bit. I suppose I was talking about kind of the area of the UK that's under farmland, and didn't really touch too much upon urban tree cover. I mean, it's interesting that actually in some cities, it looks like there's actually even higher tree canopy cover than there is in some very intensively managed arable rural environments. So parts of the fenland, which perhaps initially wouldn't have had many trees anyway, but they certainly would have had more than they do nowadays since the sort of the dawn of 20th century chemical monocultures have kind of really taken over those parts of the countryside. But there's actually, you know, far more tree cover in somewhere like London than there is in somewhere like the Fens, which is quite astonishing, really. So it's absolutely vital, of course, to have more trees in cities. We need to bring nature more into cities where obviously the vast majority of people live. And I do think that, you know, lockdown has certainly once again highlighted the really, crucial importance of having access to green space is for everyone, and also the inequalities in access to green space, and some of the stats that have come out during the last 3 or 4 months or so about people's access to parks and gardens, and inequalities in that, in terms of the less access that obviously poorer communities, black households, minority ethnic households have to urban green space. I think also, I suppose, whilst I definitely encourage everyone to be getting involved in doing more around street trees. Obviously, I realise there's quite an interesting history around that in Sheffield. I'm not proposing I get into any of that. I don't know any of the details about it particularly, but the encouraging councils to do more with council-owned parks, for example. Been talking to some councils again in London, but also with Friends of the Earth local groups based in Manchester and Nottingham, who did some tree planting during last year's National Tree Week, working with their local councils to kind of add trees into council-owned municipal parks, to kind of not to remove recreation space, but to actually sort of enhance the kind of edges of those parks, which perhaps aren't currently being used for kind of football pitches or anything like that, but to have them in addition, so that there's spaces. Also things like having wildflower meadow parts to parks as well. I guess I am really interested in the more rural angles to this, partly because I guess when we're looking at the big picture here of trying to really increase tree cover across the UK, whilst the access to nature aspects of this are absolutely crucial, the amenity aspects of it are crucial. I think we also do have to start looking at what can be changed out in the countryside as well. What can we encourage farmers and landowners to do more? And I guess one of the areas where it overlaps is around green belts. So I think there's a really good case to start really investing in greening our green belts more than they currently are. They're a vital part of the planning process, and a vital kind of like break on urban sprawl and development. But I think we could probably all agree that there's more that could be done to enhance nature and number of trees, for example, as well as other habitat in our green spaces that are just on our doorsteps outside our cities. So I think that's something we need to be doing more of as well. I hope that answers at least some of the question.
Great, thank you. Got an anonymous attendee who's got a question about HS2 targets to plant trees, which actually I think I was watching something on Twitter this morning that I think this might allude to, but how do we hold government accountable to ensure that trees survive? So I guess in terms of the sort of biodiversity offsetting that might come with a big infrastructure project like that. I guess the question is, do they include this in their figures, or just refer to what they've planted regardless of whether or not they die? So the issue of planting versus establishment, which I think is quite an important one when we're talking about tree planting. And I guess the question, well, maybe if Luke, you were to answer first, and then Guy.
Yeah, I don't have expertise in this though, and I did notice Guy unmute, and I think he's probably much better placed than I am to talk HS2, to be honest. But yeah, you're absolutely right about establishment. Like, it's vital. We must talk about establishment, not planting, because it's easy to stick your tree in the ground, and it's much more difficult to raise it to maturity and for it to deliver all the benefits that we need of trees and woodland. So that's all I can offer on that one, I'm afraid. In terms of what government counts, I don't know, I'm afraid. So I'll hand over to Guy and hope it's not an ambulance pass.
What do I think about HS2's pledge to plant trees? Probably not a lot, really. I don't think much of it. I think the same could be said, of course, for other essentially attempts by large infrastructure projects to justify their existence by saying we're kind of offsetting some of the damage by doing something else over the hill or whatever. So similarly, even more ridiculously, I think, is Heathrow Airport proposing to offset some of the impacts of a third runway by restoring a bit of peat bog. We need to restore peat bogs, but we also don't need a third runway. So I think it comes down to the specific scheme, of course, but I don't think that we want to encourage the kind of I think technical term for it is fungibility, the kind of the market, the market in nature that essentially trades off one area for another. I mean, obviously, when it comes to ancient woodland, it is ultimately irreplaceable unless you're prepared to wait another 400 years for it to become technically ancient woodland. And obviously, then you're not going to replace the actual place that was, with all the potential culture and history around it that was destroyed. So, mitigation is by far the most important there, rather than just sort of things that potentially become greenwash. I think on the survival of trees and government figures for them, I mean, there is obviously, we talked about a natural kind of failure rate for trees anyway in nature if they were allowed to simply naturally regenerate. So, but obviously that can be increased if trees are simply planted in the wrong place, not watered. We have increasing droughts with climate change and so on. And so I think it's obviously vital to think about that, particularly when trees are being integrated into kind of perhaps slightly more unnatural environments, whether that's, town centres or, the sides of roads. But I think the government report in terms of overall figures of trees planted, but I would struggle to know whether that definitely includes, the trees that have ultimately gone on to fail. But they do also talk in their figures about actual areas of woodland being created. And I think that's the more important figure, I think, as Luke, Camilla, you were just talking about. And obviously that's talking about not just counting numbers of trees, but actually talking about the overall area of habitat created. And then we can get more into the interesting bits of the quality of that habitat. It's not just simply a numbers game. It's about the quality of the kind of the dynamic habitat that's been created, the species it reintroduced at the same time, and so on.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question we got from Sally, which is, I guess this may be a bit more for Luke, but what are the strategies regarding natural regeneration, given that scrub is a really valuable habitat? I think there's a question a little bit further on about rewilding, which I think this might sort of return to. So often when as Guy, you said at the beginning of your talk, it is possible just to leave land and for trees just to start to grow. So the arguments made for planting or just for creating the conditions for trees to naturally regenerate, and how those factor into the targets.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting one and a massive topic, which I'll try to condense into a 2-minute answer. I mean, really, I think probably in an absolutely ideal world, if we had the perfect site, we probably would create new native woodlands through natural regeneration or new native wood pastures. We get trees that are really well adapted to the site. We get a brilliant scrubby habitat en route to mature woodland, as Sally mentioned in the question, which is really, really important. And it's low cost. So it sounds perfect. The challenge is that, for lots of factors we do understand, and probably even more factors we don't understand, it doesn't always work quickly. So it sometimes takes us, we've got sites in the National Trust where we're waiting 30 years on, we've still just got a real thick thatch of grass sward and not much else going on, which isn't great for wildlife or, our woodland ambitions. Equally, we've got places down at Slindon where I showed you, the natural regeneration there is out-competing the planted trees. It's like 2 to 1. It's unbelievable. 5 years in, I should have mentioned actually, that photo was 5 years in. We've got willows that are 12 or 15 feet high, natural regen. Oaks taller than me, natural regen. And then the plantings, probably my kind of height. So that location would have been fantastic for a natural regeneration project. But other places it doesn't work. So I think what we're sort of saying at the moment is, where we're talking woodland creation, we have to be sure natural regen is going to work if we're going to use that route. The other thing is species composition. So our treescape is pretty denuded even of natural canopy species at the moment. We're low on big tree species in Britain. So we might need to supplement the natural regen with other species if we only get a limited range, because we want a big range of species, as big as is appropriate for that particular site, to make the woods resilient to future threats, whether that's climate change related threats or pests and diseases. So we might have to supplement our natural regen. And then we also have to really think about ground prep. So whether that's using livestock or machinery, we can assist natural regen to get started by making sure the ground's in the right condition that seeds are going to take hold. So there's those 3 big caveats to it, really. What does that mean in practice for us? Definitely areas of natural regen are included in our target, and some of our woodland creation schemes will have areas of natural regeneration. But if we want to be sure of locking up that carbon in terms of our woodland creation target and our net zero target, it's probably not going to be the majority of our land. But what I would also say is, out with the carbon ambition and the woodland creation ambition, we've also got a much, much bigger ambition just for managing land for nature. And so on top of all that compartmentalized stuff, so to speak, there's also a place for rewilding projects, huge wood pasture schemes that we're not counting the carbon benefit of necessarily towards our target, but it's the right thing to do for nature or for that landscape. So it's all there, but yeah, there's definitely some watch outs in terms of pure woodland creation.
Brilliant. I guess the next question links quite nicely in that question from John, who's curious to know if it would be possible for tree guards to be made of another substance like hemp resin, is his suggestion, considering the carbon capture capacity that it has, and whether or not there's any sense that this could be innovated by university, or, you know, essentially where might that go as an idea?
Do you want me to start with that?
Yeah.
I don't have any particular knowledge of whether hemp resin could be used, and it's an interesting idea. Certainly, obviously, is used in sustainable building projects as well. But I mean, certainly something we tried to do when we did a little bit of tree planting with some of our friends in the local groups last year was source some biodegradable. They were a bioplastic, but they were claimed to be biodegradable. We wanted to see what that did, and we want to go back to some of the projects and see whether it does decompose in a way that is, you know, sustainable. There are also cardboard, kind of quite thick cardboard, kind of egg box type cardboard tree guards out there. People are starting to innovate, but obviously, I guess the other thing is, can you find places where it's possible to simply plant trees without the guards at all, but ensure that things like the grazing regime is, you know, small enough or is able to be compatible with trees being planted and growing. So, you know, ideally probably not sheep, which are going to nibble everything down to the ground. Perhaps, you know, some cattle might, you know, particularly traditional breeds of cattle are able to, you know, kind of get on with trees as well, particularly if you're also allowing things like, you know, briars and brambles to grow up, through which shoots can survive because they won't get browsed by livestock getting close. So fencing and appropriate grazing regimes are also alternatives to having kind of horrible plastic tree guards everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, just to add again a little bit of sort of National Trust colour to that, I suppose Guy's absolutely right. You know, there's lots of alternatives available. Definitely the first option should just be excluding livestock from an area, or excluding whatever the impact on the trees might be, and not individually guarding them at all. And if you need to individually guard them, then, you know, there's cardboard tubes which work reasonably well, and there's the bioplastic, and there are some that claim to be you know, biodegradable, but they just biodegrade into lots of bits of plastic. And then there are some which you have to take away and hot compost, but that's probably still better than taking them away for plastic recycling. So our current biggest woodland creation projects in the lowlands, we're trialing all of those options at the moment on National Trust land. Up in the uplands, we're still on the plastic tubes, and that really is the last place where we think it's really necessary, when you know you're going to have livestock right amongst the trees, and, you know, you're in a really harsh environment. There aren't too many really viable alternatives at the moment, but I do think that there will be bioplastic guards of a size that are big enough for that environment really soon, because the manufacturers have realized nobody wants the plastic ones anymore. You know, it's just a market thing now. But yeah, we do need the other options.
Camilla, do you mind if I just came back on just the natural regen question, because the one that Sally had asked, just because I wanted to add something about the government interest or lack of interest in natural regeneration. So the England Tree Strategy that I mentioned earlier, the big consultation document that's currently out, it makes only 1 or 2 references to natural regeneration of trees, and only one question that they ask on it. It's our understanding that was actually snuck in there at the last minute by Natural England. So some of the other civil servants in DEFRA who come from the Forestry Commission and sort of more forestry background are less keen on tree regeneration. We think that the minister responsible for this, Zach Goldsmith, is keen on natural regeneration. It's just that some of his officials are telling him that it's probably not feasible on any great scale. So I think it's really important, if people want to see more of this being promoted and supported at a national level, at a government level, that you please do submit your views to that consultation. As I mentioned, you know, we've included natural regeneration as one of the asks in our kind of template action that you can take. or just write something more detailed to the consultation and say, this is absolutely vital, we need to have more support for it.
Yeah, and I think that's, I think, like I said, there's more questions that relate to maybe rewilding more specifically, but I think the general public interest in that, like it's redemptive is, I think there's a word that I would use for it, as the way, especially I think the way in which it is often presented. And I think seeing a strategy be developed that doesn't actually take that into consideration is something that, if it's within our powers to say anything about, it's important to do so. We've got a slightly different shift, a question which, so this is a kind of asking your thoughts. This is from Claire. She's wondering what your thoughts are about large areas of land where a site has spent 20 plus years rewilding, now covered in trees and rich in wildlife, but which is at risk of development because it's been allocated in a development plan decades ago. So obviously it's sat without anything having happened. And bearing in mind that we need more trees, how can we make developers and councils realise that it's not just about planting, but also protecting what we have, and that offsetting is not good enough? So I guess that, how would a space like that be factored into our sort of ambitions for woodland creation? Guy, would you like to go first? Then Luke?
Sure. Obviously not familiar with the details of the specific issue, but I mean, it does sound, similar to other situations like I can think of, like a Lodge Hill, which some of you may have heard of, which used to be a big MOD site in Kent, and it stopped being a military site for decades and rewilded, and it became the #1 site for nightingales in England. But then it came, MOD said, well, we're going to dispose of it, and we're going to sell it off for housing. And then obviously, then the question becomes, well, what has been done to factor in the fact that this is not just an old military derelict site, it is now essentially a fantastic nature reserve. So I don't know who owns this site that you're referring to, Claire, but I mean, obviously, if it's been previously brought into a development plan, I mean, calling on the council to be able to review that and say, well, let's look at what has changed in the interim period. Clearly, we're talking about a very different land use and landscape than what was the case, 20 or 30 years ago. So, that's what I'd suggest, really. If there's any review of the local plan coming up or anything like that, or any objections you can make, I think that would be my suggestion.
Luke?
Yeah, I don't have anything unbelievably wise to say on this, with it being sort of not within the National Trust experience, really. But I think I would agree, Lodge Hill is a real prime example that's become like quite a sort of touchstone in the world of conservation. And, I mean, what it does illustrate is that, maybe this is just my optimistic nature, but you do feel like the worm is turning, albeit frustratingly slowly, that there is an understanding of the different uses we need of land now, whether that's agricultural or urban. And tree planting and woodland creation and climate mitigation are becoming so much more mainstream. We've just heard so much more about them in the last year, and I do think, I'd love to think that local councils are able to take those factors into their reviewed plans and think more holistically about land, so that it does deliver all the different benefits we need from it. But yeah, it's well outside my experience, I'm afraid, in urban or sort of brownfield spaces.
And so thank you. And the next question is from Denise. It's for you, Luke, which is, you mentioned you planting near towns, so the people and nature mantra, and the question is, has the National Trust identified specific urban areas for this? So I guess maybe hinting at, are there any near Sheffield or other?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting there, so there's two factors, really. So, I mean, the short answer is no, there are none near Sheffield, but basically, so in terms of that bit of analysis we did, where I said we'd identified where our land near big conurbations that is boring farmland, where we could do afforestation projects because it isn't important in terms of habitat or views or anything like that. So what we looked at really was our existing National Trust holding. So there's some places that really spring to mind, which are away from here, but that some of you may know because they're not too far away or from holidays and stuff. So places like Dunham Massey in South Manchester. I mean, it really is tucked up in a corner of the South Manchester suburbs. And it is a giant, boring estate, apart from this sort of jewel at the heart of it, which is the old parkland. So there's a huge opportunity there. Killerton estate in Devonshire, right next to Exeter, a massive agricultural estate with, again, parts of it highly valuable, but lots of it doesn't have a lot of current value in terms of benefit for the nation. So that could be, a real potential one. So those are the types of places we're talking about. And then places in the southeast where we've got a much more fragmented land holding, but obviously there's a lot more people. So lots of our land down there is really close to a lot of people. So those are the places we're looking at already, the existing land, I suppose. What we've also committed to in our strategy in January is green corridors. So these will be partnership projects, and the ambition is to achieve 20 of these by 2030. And the Sheffield link there is they're actually based on the Porter Brook and the series of parks along the Porter Brook. That was the inspiration. So the idea being that these are green spaces that would take people from city centres or relatively central areas of the city out to the countryside through green spaces and treed areas, wooded landscapes. But we would never have been in a position to acquire that land. That was always be a partnership project with local councils and other groups and partners. And post-COVID, even more so, that will be a partnership thing where we'll hopefully leverage the ambition and the resources and the partnerships to really get that moving. So will Sheffield get one? No, because it's already got one. So that's the answer there, I suppose. I think that's the sort of most Sheffield answer to that question. Other opportunities may arise, and we'll definitely have our eyes open for them. But the world has definitely changed in the National Trust with COVID. So, yeah.
I'm just going to quickly check in. So it's now 2:00. We've still got, I think we've got some thanks, but we've got some more questions. I was just wanted to check in with Luke and Guy that you're okay to talk for another 20 minutes or so, or not. You can give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. We could do shorter, longer.
So 5 or 10, I might need to go and make another call, I'm afraid, but I can stay.
That's okay. So how in now or?
I'm sure I can stay for 5 or 10 minutes. Yeah.
5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
What I'll just quickly do is I'll scan through and I'll see if there's any specific questions for you. Everyone can see my scrolling face. It's a knotted brow. Okay, now I think, look, everything looks quite sort of general. So I'll just try and go through them quickly. And yeah, let's say 10 minutes. And there's a question from Sally, which this came up before. The opinion that you might have on this idea of mini forests. There was an article that was in the news a few weeks ago about this. Luke, I know that you've been reading some of the papers written by.
Yeah, I need to read them more closely. Yeah, I mean, I just saw this in the newspaper as well. We were talking before, and I'm really interested in it, but I want to understand the science better. So yeah, I've downloaded a couple of the guys' papers to understand some of the claims that were made in the article a bit better. But I mean, the short answer is we should be trying it all. And for me, that particular intervention, particularly in an urban environment or right close to where people live, just sounds brilliant in engaging people, creating that real quick win in terms of visual impact, maybe a short-term, faster biodiversity impact than a typical woodland creation project or typical tree planting would. And if it doesn't work, so be it. We'll clear them and we'll plant some new ones. None of this is forever, and not, lots of it is no regrets when we do this kind of thing. So yeah, I think it sounds exciting and definitely worth looking at.
Bro. We'll go, just going to whiz through. So the next question is from Christine. Is the National Trust willing or able to acquire land in suburban areas where rewilding is well underway? So I guess one of the things I guess is maybe worth clarifying is the difference between natural regeneration and rewilding, and if that's something that do the edges of cities offer a sort of opportunity for a kind of a blend of what could be interpreted as rewilding or natural regeneration, and what role does land ownership have in that, I guess, is always
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a bit how long is a piece of string with rewilding, isn't it? You know, both in terms of the length of my answer and the definitions. I mean, it's been a really useful concept in exciting people about really ambitious nature conservation, and it's great. But it is a massive spectrum, you know, and lots of things we've been doing in nature conservation for many years could fall under the rewilding spectrum. And then at the far end, you've got species reintroductions and, you know, giant tracts of land left to nature. So I think it's really important to recognise that there's no one size fits all definition for that. And sometimes the term, you know, as much as I'm not for a minute being negative about rewilding, but it can be unhelpful sometimes in the way we refer to different projects. So there's just something to be mindful of about what we're actually talking about. And yeah, but I think you could say that the natural regeneration that's happening on a brownfield site is a rewilding of that site. There's no two ways about it really. But is that the same as reintroducing bison and, you know, lynx? Not quite. I mean, it'd be cool. I'd love to see it, but you know, it's on a very different end of the spectrum, is what I'm saying, I suppose. In terms of land tenure, yeah, it is. I mean, it's absolutely key to conservation, really, and sustainable land management. In direct answer to the exact question, would the National Trust be interested in that sort of land? I would just say my experience of the National Trust is not to rule anything out, and certainly in recent years with nature conservation being front and centre of the strategy and us wanting to really link that to people and where people live, we have been more ambitious about acquisition. And sometimes we're in, it's you know, you get in really funny, strange circumstances where you just find someone's left us. For instance, that one at Slindon's a really good example. A person left us well over £1 million purely for the acquisition of woodland in East Sussex. But there's no woodland to buy in East Sussex. So that money was sat in a pot for 40 years. And then our lawyers managed to sort of convince the donor family that we could spend it on woodland creation rather than woodland acquisition. And you find all kinds of weird little things like that in the National Trust where, you know, we might be scraping around for 2 pennies to do something really important, and there's a really defined bequest from someone lying in a fund. And we often find that with acquisitions, that's how we acquire land. The big thing I would say though is, again, COVID has changed all this, and acquisition is completely off the table for a good few years. Who knows how many? Even if we've got a fund that's completely defined for that purpose in a particular area, politically, we're not acquiring anything anytime soon. Everything like that is just gone with COVID. We just can't do it. We've got to look after what we've got. But yeah, in the very long term, who knows?
Well, Guy?
I would just say that, you know, if it's an option, if you've got particular land in mind that you want to acquire for kind of a community nature reserve or park, is it possible to do something in the order of, you know, kind of a crowdfunder, kind of set up a community land trust? Obviously, land is very expensive, often, particularly in areas where the land could be developed, and the hope value is baked into the land value. But you know, this is where it starts to get into things like, well, could we in future move towards more of a system of community right to buy like they have in Scotland, where there is greater support for community groups being able to, you know, make a bid, essentially have first right of refusal on land that's considered to be a kind of community interest or community value, and access to more public funds to be able to do that. But obviously at the moment that looks like not something that's going to happen. Indeed, the risk is that you know, the economic crisis that we're walking into may lead to more sales of public sector land rather than, you know, government being prepared to hold on to it or support community purchases. So I think that's one of the things we're actually being wary of, a further round of public sector land sales, particularly of land which may seem to be, you know, not of any value, but actually has got loads of nature value, is really important to be wary of and to look out for, to campaign against.
I think that segues quite nicely into the next question, which is, if political will for increasing tree cover is something that is currently lacking, how do we change the priorities of those in power? So yeah, and I think because we've only got a few more minutes, so maybe if we have this as the last question, and I apologise to everyone who's not, I feel vindicated that this has been as interesting as I ever thought it might be. So I'm sorry that some questions haven't been answered, but I'm sure both of you are on Twitter, aren't you? So it could well be that some of these conversations could continue in other places. But in the meantime, how might we change the political sort of understanding of tree cover?
Shall I go?
Yeah, you go.
I mean, ultimately, you know, politicians make pledges when they're running for election, and people can be understandably cynical or skeptical that those pledges ever mean anything. But unless we do hold politicians to the pledges they make and then try and force them to raise their sights higher, then they really will get a free pass. They really will just get off scot-free with being able to say anything they want and then, you know, never have to deliver on it. So I think it's really important that everyone does hold, you know, the government to account for what it did say it's going to do. You know, there's certain pledges they've made on tree cover, increasing tree cover and increasing tree planting. You know, we don't think they're good enough. We also think that there's obviously clearly huge support for the environment and for climate change, even during obviously the other crises we're facing in terms of COVID-19 and the economy. You know, you look at the opinion polling and still climate is like one of the top 3 issues that people say is important to them and one of the biggest issues facing Britain and the world. It clearly is. And so, you know, continuing to hold the government's feet to the fire on these pledges that they made and asking them to go further because there is huge public and electoral support for doing so, I think is absolutely key. And that's how we change their priorities.
Brilliant. Thank you. Luke?
I mean, as I sort of anticipated, that's why I let Guy go first. You know, he's a professional campaigner and he was able to articulate that answer brilliantly. And, you know, as a sort of professional woodsman and land manager, I don't have such a brilliant answer. So I would just really support guys. You know, we have to hold their feet to the fire. We have to hold government to account. And, you know, not to get too skeptical or big picture about it, but, you know, that's an increasing challenge at the moment. You know, we all know it's easy to be cynical about this government and how much they care about what we think, but we've got to try our damnedest to hold them to account.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you very, very much for a fascinating talk. Like I said, this has been recorded, so if anyone, within 24 hours, this is going to be online. We'll post links to the campaigns and pages. I think not least the amazing, there's a very fun interactive map on the Friends of the Earth website where you can play around with all of these things. So I'll make sure that that's there as well. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been really appreciated, and apologies that we haven't got through everyone's questions. I wish there could be a round of applause. There can't be a round of applause, but it's been fantastic. It's going to end in a rather sort of unceremonious way, as is Zoom. We'll all be sat in our living rooms, just not having quite such fascinating conversation about tree planting. Anyway,